In this special series of Afternoon Light, you'll hear from participants in our Menzies Early Career Network, a program for university students to learn, research, publish on a topic of Australian contemporary history and liberal thought. The students' essays will be published in a new book, Menzies Rediscovered, a new generation's inspiration for political philosophy, domestic challenges and foreign affairs, in March 2026. Far from the caricature of a forelock-tugging Anglophile was Robert Menzies, whose government signed the ANZUS Treaty with the United States, who personally developed strong relationships with not just one but 5 US presidents, and went on to become a frequent traveller and admirer of the United States in his post-political career. As part of this year's Menzies Early Career Network in 2025, my guest today has written a paper on an American odyssey, forging the Australian-American alliance. So welcome, Charlie Hume, to Afternoon Light.
Hey, Georgina. It's very nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. And you've just finished the Menzies Early Career Network,
Yes.
Our university student program, where you research a paper, write the paper, and then we will publish it early next year. And part of the experience, of course, is this podcast. Tell me about MECN, as we call it, rolls off the tongue. How's the experience been for you?
I've actually loved it. I've loved the whole thing. Ever since we started, I've really enjoyed being able to really get deep into a research project. Like we were saying just a second ago, I did arts for a year and then switched into commerce, and it's a very practical degree, but I far more enjoy doing long-winded research assignments and essays. So it was nice to sort of jump back into that.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so you've chosen the ANZUS alliance, the alliance with the United States. I mean, there's arguments over whether it is an alliance or it's a treaty that is a bit like an alliance. Menzies famously said it was built on a foundation of jelly. He was a bit of an ANZUS skeptic early on, although I think he was definitely a convert by the end. Why did you choose this particular topic?
At the time that we were choosing the topics, all of the news was about how the current Australian government was in the middle of a rift with the Trump administration. So it felt very topical to discuss maybe the origins of the relationship. And my original plan was to maybe compare and contrast, but that evolved obviously as the process went on.
Yeah, and so this paper you've written, the chapter you've written, starts off with a bit of a telling about the early trip to the United States that Menzies took. He was one of, I think he was the 3rd Prime Minister of Australia to actually visit the United States. I mean, you think it's just an absolute rite of passage for every Australian Prime Minister these days, an early visit to the United States, so, go and meet the President. But it was quite unusual in the Menzies era. Can you tell me about that trip?
Yeah, I think, you're right. I think Billy Hughes and Chifley had both gone, but Menzies went first in 1941 to really press for American support with Roosevelt, which I think he came back fairly disappointed because this was prior to Pearl Harbor and he didn't really get what he was wanting from the Americans. But it was a pretty important point, I think, as a starting point of the relationship. History has very often pointed to John Curtin's very, very famous quote after Pearl Harbor saying that Australia looks to America after the fall of Singapore and sort of British withdrawal from the Pacific. But I think Menzies laid the groundwork for establishing a relationship with Washington and a dialogue that said that we were mutual defenders of democracy. We had common beliefs and were fighting the same fight. I think he started the work, which then Curtin continued, and then he obviously continued again through the rest of his second term.
Yeah. So his obviously first interaction is with President Roosevelt in World War II. He gets to know 5 presidents over his time as Prime Minister. I mean, that in itself is quite extraordinary. Most of our Prime Ministers might meet 2, but to have had a counterpart as a US president in 5 different individuals is testament, I guess, to the longevity of Menzies' time in office. He also, of course, got to know President Nixon very well as President Eisenhower's vice president in the 50s. So, you could argue he even knew 6 presidents very, very well. What was his relationship like with President Roosevelt in World War II?
I think his relationship with Roosevelt was... He had a really good quote actually about Roosevelt, which was that Roosevelt was very much envious of the sort of great man diplomacy of Churchill. And obviously, as the war goes on, we all know that sort of Roosevelt absolutely joined in on that, the famous meeting with Stalin. I think Menzies certainly saw himself as a part of that too. So maybe that was a reason why they could get along. But Menzies wrote in his memoirs that they got along, but I think their meetings were fairly brief, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, it was very troubled times. But there is that sense that it was the leaders, and they were all men, the men who were really forging those relationships through sort of personal connections and personal negotiations rather than so much the sort of big picture values, interests piece.
Yes.
Would you say that you found that in your research?
Yeah, definitely. And I think especially the case with Roosevelt, because at that time Australia didn't really have an independent foreign policy sort of platform. We were a part of the British Commonwealth and the British Empire and sort of acted through them. So Menzies' first outreaches to Washington in 1941 were very personal, and they were basically all built upon the personal relationships that he was able to make. I think there was a quote by, maybe it was Roosevelt, who said that he met every great man in Washington, every politician, every business leader, to try and convince them to, if not join the war, support Australia's cause in the war.
I mean, Menzies' 1941 visit to the United States obviously not just attracted the attention of President Roosevelt, but the US media was very keen on the visit. I think the New York Times described Menzies' speeches as moving and reiterated his stance that the US was tied to the cause of war, and the editor of the Washington Post apparently cabled Churchill to say that Menzies should extend his trip in America because of his influence on the US administration. So you get that sense that Menzies was making, I think, an outsized impact of an Australian Prime Minister in the US at that stage. I can't imagine the New York Times and the Washington Post these days getting quite so fired up about Anthony Albanese visiting. But maybe I'm wrong. I
think that's probably indicative of Menzies' entire time as Prime Minister, is making an outsized impact as an Australian leader. But especially during that 1941 visit, I think as well the timing of it would play a big part. I mean, he had just come straight from London and had been there during the Blitz. So I'd really seen the horrors of the war firsthand. And this was before Australia had any, I hate to say personal stake, but this was before the war in the Pacific had really started to heat up. So, I mean, we weren't personally under threat just yet, and he was very much trying to defend Europe and trying to defend Britain at that point. And I think in the US, obviously, domestically, they were fairly torn on whether or not they were going to join in too. I mean, obviously the Nazis, morally reprehensible, and they wanted to fight them. But at the same time, they didn't want to get involved in a European conflict again.
Do you see some parallels to, for example, Volodymyr Zelensky going to Washington and asking President Trump to help in the cause, the Ukrainian-Russian war, being rebuffed, and then the domestic issues around whether the US should be involved in a European war or not? I mean, there seems to me to be some pretty stark parallels there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, well, to be honest, the leader of a war-torn country coming to America and pleading for help from the world's greatest power, I think it probably is a media spectacle, which is probably why it gets so much attention. And yeah, it's the exact same issue. It's something that people can rally behind theoretically, but the practicality of it is we're sending money, we're sending people, we're putting people in danger. So obviously it becomes a more difficult discussion when we're actually talking about the practical politics of it all.
This 41 trip that Menzies made, he was obviously Prime Minister then, but after he returned to Australia, I think within 6 weeks he had been forced to resign, losing the support of two key independents.
Yeah.
And then I guess the Prime Ministership was handed over to Labor's John Curtin eventually once they got through the little interregnum there. I mean, this trip to the United States, for Menzies, was it worth the political sacrifice he ultimately had to make?
Well, it wasn't just a trip to the United States. I mean, as I said, it started off as a trip to the UK, and he was there for a very long time, and then travelled to the United States on his way home and spent a while there as well. And I think he went to Canada too, went to Ottawa. So he was gone for a long time. I mean, people get angry at Anthony Albanese for being gone for a week these days. So to imagine a Prime Minister gone for, the best of eight months or something like that is, I can understand why there would be turmoil at home once he gets back. But obviously there were other factors going on as well. The UAP was a mess of a political organisation, which he knew acutely. I think it was worth it in the end. I think the relationship that he was able to build in Washington, it would have absolutely helped Curtin in a few months' time when he became Prime Minister. I think it was Menzies that actually set up Australia's embassy in Washington. So he laid the groundwork for the diplomatic communication sort of infrastructure. And it helped him ultimately in his second term too. I mean, he built a reputation. The people that were involved in the Roosevelt government were involved in the Truman government when Menzies was back in power in 1949. So I think it definitely helped. And it probably was, if not a sacrifice worth making, it was definitely a worthwhile decision.
It's interesting. Dame Patty, Robert Menzies' wife, famously cautioned him against going away for so long. She said, if you go away for that long, within 6 weeks of your return, you'll be no longer Prime Minister. And she was absolutely right. But anyway, he came back again, of course, in 1949. And the US president had changed then. It's Truman. What was that relationship like? I mean, clearly fruitful given he gets the ANZUS Treaty in 1951.
I think it was probably one of the strongest relationships that he had with the president over his tenure. He obviously had come back into the political life fairly triumphant, I think, and was very eager to post-war get US assurances on security and did a very good job with that in achieving ANZUS. And I think one of the big reasons why that was actually not even Menzies' efforts entirely. It was when he was travelling to the United States, his foreign minister and acting prime minister, Fadden, I think.
Fadden was his treasurer. Yes, an acting prime minister.
Yeah. And Percy Spender, who was the foreign minister. They decided to commit Australian troops to Korea while Menzies was still on the boat before he was able to give approval. And the reason why they did this was so they could beat Britain essentially to the punch. They wanted to prove to the United States that they were eager to join the war independently from Britain, which really helped because by the time, the story goes that Menzies' ship lands in America and he gets a phone call and he was livid, but then gets off the boat and proudly exclaimed that it was all his idea and everyone in Washington was very proud of him. And I think that was actually a really big reason why he was able to maybe get ANZUS across the line and then ultimately CEDAW, was it demonstrated that Australia was willing to help the United States in their post-war sort of Pacific affairs as an independent actor, not just as a player of the Commonwealth and as a supplicant of Britain.
So what about his relationship with President Eisenhower? I always think this is interesting because, the Liberal Party and the US Republican Party are often seen as, I guess, ideologically fellow travellers, brother parties, sister parties, if you like, whereas the Democrats and the Labor Party here in Australia are, more the sort of social democrat parties, links to the trade union movement. And so of the 5 presidents Menzies served as a counterpart of, only one was a Republican in Eisenhower, the other 4 were all Democrats. And yet Eisenhower is a difficult one for Menzies, isn't he?
I think that Republican isolationism is really, really difficult for someone like Menzies who really believed in sort of global liberalism, especially following the war. I think he really struggled with the idea that the United States wanted to withdraw from, if not withdraw, then try and reduce its role in global conflicts. The great example is Suez, obviously, where Menzies really tried to over-insert himself and maybe overplayed his hand. I think actually, learning about that topic, I actually think it's pretty remarkable that an Australian Prime Minister was able to play such a significant role in a massive global sort of event in the Middle East of all places, where we aren't a relevant player, but it was his sort of stature and I get maybe even infamy and ability to insert himself that made him so relevant. But it also ended up backfiring, and that was because of Eisenhower. So from what I can recall from what I read in Afternoon Light, Menzies and Eisenhower got along personally very well, but it was the differences in perspective on global affairs that maybe was the challenge to their relationship. And I think as well, especially in the early years of Menzies' sort of second term as Prime Minister, he was really he's really wrestling with his relationship with Britain and the New World Order, essentially, which was run by the United States.
Charlie Hume, great chapter on An American Odyssey, Forging the Australian-American Alliance. Really interesting topic.
Thank you very much.
I'm glad to hear it was a good experience.
I've loved it all.
And I'm really looking forward to the launch of the book in early 2026.
Thanks, Georgina. Me too.
Thanks for listening to this special series of Afternoon Light, featuring interviews with participants in the 2025 Menzies Early Career Network. To follow more of our work, make sure you subscribe to this podcast and explore our other content at the Robert Menzies Institute website. robertmensiesinstitute.org.au.